tonight, just to give a few reminders and some housekeeping items. The webinar will be recorded. That way it can be shared out for anyone who is not able to join us. In order to keep the recording consistent, we just ask that we keep cameras off and microphones muted unless you would have something to speak upon. On behalf of the Ponca Tribe of Nebraska's DV program, I would like to welcome you all to Prevention, the Dynamics of Intimate Partner Violence and Protecting Our Native Youth, which is part 1 of our MMIP Awareness webinar series. The series is hosted by the Ponca Tribe of Nebraska in collaboration with Kirby Williams from Legal Aid of Nebraska's Native American program, as well as the Santee Sioux's DTSU's DV program and the Winnebago DV program. Kirby will be our main speaker presenting tonight. Please feel free to use the chat, raise your hand, or unmute at any point during the presentation to ask questions, comment, or connect with each other. If you would like to introduce yourselves in the chat, just so that way we're maybe familiar with who's in our audience. And not only that, but it's kind of also a nice way to maybe network or make connections with other people. We hope to have some time for questions at the end. If you'd like to verbally ask, we just ask that you either raise your hand, wait to be called on, or just wait until there's a brief moment of silence so we're not all trying to talk at the same time. Also, remember to take care of yourself throughout the presentation today, as there might be some material discussed that could be triggering for some. So without further ado, please welcome our presenter, Kirby Williams.
All right, thank you, Brooke. I'll start with Osio Nagad, Gigag Mama Davadon, Jaligi Gason, Yanig Gason, Kirby Williams, G Jaligi, Wado. Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us tonight. My name is Kirby Williams, like Brooke said, and I am a citizen of the Cherokee Nation, and I currently serve as the outreach coordinator for the Native American program with Legal Aid of Nebraska. We are so grateful to be joining the Ponca Tribe Domestic Violence Program, the Santee DTSU Domestic Violence Program, and the Winnebago Tribe Domestic Violence Intervention Program tonight, as we can sort of take on this collaborative effort to start addressing this crisis, because we know it's really going to take all of us coming together and collaborating on an ongoing basis to actually affect change and combat this crisis. So we just really appreciate you all tuning in tonight and joining us. With that, tonight's session is going to focus on really setting the foundation for talking about what the MMIP crisis is, where the awareness movement is at. We'll be talking about violence dynamics that contribute to this crisis. And then we will begin exploring how can we start to move forward in a way that helps support safer communities in the future, including protecting and empowering our youth. But also just needing to recognize that we only have an hour tonight. So we won't really be able to cover everything. I usually put it as it's really hard to pack 500 years worth of violence and genocide into 1 hour. But it's a good start to have these conversations and continue them in the future, as well as explore topics related to this crisis over the next few weeks. So this is kind of the heavier, let's see where we're at session. And then in the future sessions will be a lot more action-based, but we will give you guys some action. So you leave here today feeling like you have a direction to move forward in. Just want to reiterate what Brooke mentioned, providing everyone with sort of a trigger warning. This is a really difficult topic to address, especially for those of us who are part of the Native community. And this is a really stressful and difficult time in general right now. So we just want to acknowledge and ask that you please, please, please take care of yourself. We will never be offended if you need to leave halfway through. I know everyone's home right now. It's still the evening. You may have family obligations. So please take care of yourselves, take care of your families. And we will absolutely plan to share this recording, assuming everything works out after the presentation and on social media. So first and foremost, always take care of yourself so you can take care of others. With that, we're going to dive right on in and start off, like I said, by kind of setting the foundation. Some of you may have heard of MMIP, some of you may have not. So for those of you especially who may not be as aware of what this looks like, I tend to break this down into sort of 3 separate subcategories. So first, talking about the awareness movement. So the awareness movement for the missing and murdered Indigenous peoples crisis really gained momentum and started in Canada, and it's found its way down here to the United States. I'm always very clear when I say the awareness movement, not the crisis, because the crisis itself has actually been happening for well over 500 years. But in 2018, the US actually declared May 5th as the National Day of Awareness for Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women and Girls. And that date was chosen to honor the birthday of Hannah Harris, who was a Northern Cheyenne Nation citizen. She was a young mother, and unfortunately, she went missing and was subsequently found to have been murdered. And her family has just put in so much time and energy after what happened to Hannah, really raising awareness of this crisis and trying to ensure that what happened to Hannah hopefully doesn't happen to our other Native relatives. Common awareness, imagery you may see, and you may have seen a lot of this last week since it was May 5th, things like red dresses, either hanging in the trees, or we have red dress earrings a lot of the time. Red handprints, you may have seen a woman by the name of Jordan Marie Daniel brings 3 white horses. She actually had a red handprint across her face when she ran the Boston Marathon in prayer for MMIWG victims, and it's really taken off from there. You may see things like no more stolen sisters, no more stolen relatives, and several hashtags related to this, and all in reference to the awareness movement for this crisis. MMIP can reference the data crisis that we have on our hands. So the reality of the matter is we don't have a good, accurate count of how many of our relatives are actually missing. And what I mean by that, to give you an example, in 2016, the National Crime Information Center reported over 5,700 cases of MMIWG. NamUs, the National Persons Missing Database, only logged 116 of those cases. So we have a huge gap that between these databases and these different agencies that aren't talking to each other and may or may not be collaborating, is why we have such an issue with data collection. Now, I will say that based on these reports and based on these efforts to raise awareness of this problem, federal agencies have updated NamUs to try and be more inclusive for tribal citizens who go missing and to capture that data, but there is still a very long way to go. And for those of us here in Nebraska, this data crisis and this crisis itself very much hits close to home. So what I mean by that is there was a study by the Urban Indian Health Institute that was released back in 2018, and they decided, let's look at where this crisis is actually happening and get an idea of where we should be putting our efforts. And so they looked at 506 unique cases across 71 US cities. And what they found is that the state of Nebraska ranks 7th in the highest number of MMIWG cases for US states. And the city of Omaha, Nebraska, where I currently live, ranked 8th in the top 10 US cities for the highest number of MMIWG cases they studied. I don't know about the rest of y'all, that doesn't make me feel so great. And this poor data quality is linked to several different factors, things like poor record keeping, racial misclassification. So there's a lot of times that Native Americans are put into the system incorrectly. I know if, for instance, if I ever went missing, there's a very high likelihood that I would not be classified as Native because people have in their minds what they think a Native looks like, and that's not always the case. They also tend to neglect the importance of our tribal affiliations and how that can be crucial to helping find us and looking for connections. And a lot of times also they are just misclassified in general, or dual ethnicity, race ethnicity groups are ignored. For instance, when our Afro-Indigenous or Black Native relatives go missing, that Native part is typically left off, even though that's still very important. And it's also linked to things like underreporting and poor relationships with law enforcement, which we'll talk about here in just a moment. And then MMIP can also be in reference to the crisis itself. So why are Native Americans in particular and Indigenous people, why are we going missing at such high rates? And the reality is that a lot of the times when we in the Native community, we know a lot of these contributing factors, right? I'm sure many of you who are on this call can point to several different issues that arise. And we know a lot of the times what some of these issues are, but the reality is that whenever you're going for resources, a lot of the times you get from agencies, they say, well, we want to see data and we want to see tracking. And unfortunately, they don't have the data. There's not great data, as we already talked about. So it's difficult to get resources. And that's why there's such a push to have accountability and to have proper data collected so that we can actually start to determine primary causes and start working towards solutions. What we do know is that the CDC actually reports that murder is the 3rd leading cause of death for Native women. Violence on some reservations, I'm very clear to say some reservations, not all reservations, but some reservations, it can be 10 times higher than the national average. And there's also very little research done on folks like myself and quite a few folks in the Ponca service delivery area who actually live in urban areas. We don't necessarily live on a tribal reservation. We may not live on specific tribal lands, even though over 70% of the United States Native American population doesn't live on tribal lands. So you have a huge portion of that population that's not being studied and is being ignored when it comes to the issue at hand. And then MMIP is linked to things like intimate partner violence, human trafficking, which we'll talk about here in a moment, issues with jurisdiction and lack of clarity with jurisdiction. If y'all have ever seen the film Wind River, there's a scene where you have tribal police and you have FBI and you have like private security and BIA and all these different law enforcement agencies, and they're all screaming at each other about who has jurisdiction in the moment. And that's always kind of the thought I go back to when we're trying to navigate jurisdiction and folks maybe not necessarily wanting to take responsibility for having jurisdiction with cases like this. We also see this in differences in investigative treatment of Native cases. So there have been several families that have come forward and have said when they went to go report their loved one is missing, they were met with a response from law enforcement such as, well, they're probably just out partying. Well, they're probably just out drinking. Well, we can't file a missing persons report until it's been a certain amount of time, like 24 hours, 48 hours, 72 hours, which that's actually not true. Well, you know, we don't really have the resources to go look for them right now, so you guys are going to have to do it if you want to go look. That's actually what happened to Hannah Harris's family. They were the ones who had to organize the search for her, get everyone together, make sure that search parties were actually happening, and they were the ones who actually found her because they did not get the support they should have had. And that's not to say that that's happening everywhere, but it's happened enough times across Indian country, across the United States, that what happens is that we in Native communities across Indian country hear these stories. And a lot of times that leads to underreporting out of fear that if we try to go forward, we try to report our loved ones as missing, that we're not going to be taken seriously, right? That they're not actually going to follow through, whether that is the case or not. And so that's where you have a lot of underreporting happening. And then there's also a lack of media coverage, not just in who we are as Native people. You've probably seen several news stories regarding a major news network referring to us as something else, you know, having some issues with folks promoting our erasure and acting as if we don't exist anymore. But especially when we talk about the missing and murdered crisis, maybe some news networks will pick up on a case or two that become really popular, maybe that spark legislation of some kind. But for the most part, most of the awareness around this has come from Native communities organizing and promoting these stories on social media and really utilizing that tool to get the word out when we have a relative who's missing or when we have a case. But I think it's also important to point out that in spite of all of this, this is absolutely nothing new. So we've kind of grounded ourselves in the foundation of where we're at right now. But a lot of the times I get the question of, well, you say this is happening and it's been happening for like hundreds of years. Why is that? Why is this happening? And I like to kind of give us a little bit of context when it comes to how colonization and violence have impacted the Native communities since Western European colonization. So to start this, I want to talk a little bit about how we tended to operate as tribes prior to this Western European contact that we're talking about. So prior to Western European contact in 1492 and that guy getting lost on a boat, typically what you found, and now I'm very clear when I say this is most tribes, not all tribes. I certainly don't speak for all tribes. But in most tribes, what we find when we look back is that there was this inherent balance between men and women and individuals within the tribe, all based on this sort of mutual respect and responsibility, working together for the betterment of each other. Women were regarded as sacred oftentimes. This was due to our likeness to the earth. So very much in the same way the earth gives us life and sustains our lives, that is something to be respected and honored, and women hold that same role. And so they were leaders in the tribe. We see this also with our two-spirit relatives. So for those of you who may not be familiar with the term Two-Spirit, this is more of a modern day term to reference a gender role that was believed to be common amongst most, if not all, Native American communities prior to Western European contact, very much in the way that we talk about the LGBTQIA plus community oftentimes, but this is a gender role. And it had different manifestations between different tribes. But these individuals were also very respected, very valued, protected leaders. There were certain ceremonies that only a Two-Spirit person could actually perform. And again, that was something to be honored and valued as sacred. And so that's not to say that violence didn't occur, but it was handled very differently than how we see it nowadays. So first and foremost, when a survivor came forward, they were believed, they were supported, they were consulted on what needed to happen to help with their healing. And violent men were seen as being incapable of being leaders. If you couldn't control yourself, if you couldn't protect our women and our children and our Two-Spirit relatives and the individuals in the tribe, you had no business making decisions on behalf of the tribe and could face any kind of punishment from being banished or ostracized from the tribe, having to pay some kind of restitution or suffer some retaliation or anything that was in consultation with the survivor and their family. So then it's a little different. We start to see this shift when we have Western European contact. And so what we find is that colonizers recognize this inherent value that we've put in each other, and especially in our women and our young girls and our children and our Two-Spirit relatives. And that's where we start to see rape and violence against Natives, and especially Native women, being used as these tools of colonization, all in an effort to, quote unquote, conquer us. And so what we oftentimes see then is a shift where tribes, in an effort to ensure our survival and to try and stop this violence, we start to see this assimilation and adoption of these Western European patriarchal norms instead of our tribal customs. And that was a means of survival. So when I say this has been happening for well over 500 years, it's important to recognize that Native people, and especially young Native women and girls and Two-Spirit relatives, have been traded, raped, bought, sold, kidnapped, and exploited since the time of European colonization, since 1492, since that guy got lost on a boat. You may just now be kind of hearing about it. We also see this continue on with US federal policy. There are sort of 5 distinct eras in US federal policy when dealing with the quote unquote Indian problem. So the first is the era of removal, this mentality of we're gonna take you from your homelands, we're gonna set you somewhere else. Every tribe that is headquartered here in the state of Nebraska faced some form of removal and being pushed off of their original homelands. We see this in the era of reservation. The mentality of this is your plot of land, you don't leave. If you leave, you get in trouble. For those of you who may not know the story of Chief Standing Bear, to kind of give you a very quick summary, the Ponca tribe was removed down to Oklahoma. Chief Standing Bear left the reservation to go bury his son back in their homelands along the Niobrara River. And he was arrested because he left the reservation, because you're not supposed to do that. And that's happening during this era. We see this in the era of assimilation. Operating under US federal mentality of, oh yes, and as Brooke pointed out, today is also Chief Standing Bear Day. So if you don't know Chief Standing Bear story, please, please, please go check it out. It's inspiring to say the least. We see this in the era of assimilation. So this mentality of we're going to quote unquote kill the Indian to save the man. And this is where we see the boarding school era come out of this, where literally Native children are kidnapped, sent to typically Christian-run boarding schools, and they suffer extensive physical, sexual, and emotional abuse, cultural abuse, all in an effort to assimilate them. And this actually happened up until the 1970s. A lot of people tend to think this happened a long time ago, but it actually has been happened for a very long time until the Indian Child Welfare Act in 1978. And then finally, we see this in the era of termination. So this mentality of the US government has tried everything, and they finally have just decided, you know what, we're gonna terminate you as a federally recognized tribe. You don't exist anymore, you're not our problem anymore. This is actually what happened to the Ponca tribe of Nebraska. They were terminated as a federally recognized tribe. They were not re-recognized until 1990, and they have been fighting tirelessly to get back a lot of what they lost. Currently, hypothetically, we are in the era of self-determination, meaning that this actually started with the passage of the Indian Civil Rights Act, Indian Religious Freedom Act, and Indian Self-Determination Act. It is hypothetically more okay for us to be Native people today than it ever has been before. Now, I say hypothetically because obviously everything is not settled. We still have to fight for our tribal sovereignty. We still have to fight to be recognized for who we are as people. But it is, I can even at least acknowledge the privilege that I have that even my parents and my grandparents didn't have, where my grandfather used to have to go to ceremony or powwow in secret. I can speak my language with you all today. I'm currently wearing my jewelry. I can freely be who I am for the most part. So hopefully everybody can take a deep breath because that's a lot. And I know this is a really heavy topic to kind of get us into this discussion. But if you're sitting there and you're thinking that's got to add up over time, you would be absolutely 100% right. And there is this concept that talks about that emotional and psychological wounding across lifespans and generations that sort of emanates in this massive group trauma that is something known as historical trauma. This is a term that was coined by Dr. Maria Yellowhorse Braveheart, and really is, you can apply it not only to the Native American community, you see this with really any marginalized community. And this impacts us not only on a social level, a psychological level, an emotional level, but also on a physical level, that you can actually see this where it affects our DNA across time and generations, and it continues to impact us. And that's why we see things like decreased life expectancy, higher rates of PTSD, mental health disparities, and suicide. All of this that has happened across time continues to impact us today. So when someone says, oh, well, you should just get over it, it happened 500 years ago, we kind of can't. And it's recognizing how that feeds into today, because we still continue to experience circumstances that contribute to trauma. We see this through targeted legislation to terminate our tribal sovereignty and eliminate us as a people. There are groups out there who are trying to get rid of the Indian Child Welfare Act, who don't think we should have access to our children and should teach them our cultural ways. You also see this in the high rates of suicide and poverty and substance abuse and violence, like we're talking about today. So again, this just all continues to add up and to impact across time. So when we talk about violence specifically, and specifically looking at intimate partner violence, since that's my area of expertise and that's what all the domestic violence programs are focused on here with the tribes, we're really focused on what's rooted in power and control of one person over another. All of these crimes up here on the slide you can see are all rooted in that sense of power and control of one person over another. The manifestation of it is very complicated sometimes, and we see it manifest in different ways. So with domestic violence and dating violence, like I said, we're looking at a pattern of abusive behavior. So things like physical abuse. A lot of times people tend to think that just occurs when we see sort of the outright examples or the more obvious forms with things like, hitting, kicking, choking, punching. But it's also more subtle forms. It's things like taking away someone's access to leave a situation, not granting them the ability to get help. I actually used to work with previous offenders of domestic violence, and I had to work with a guy who he took his girlfriend's cell phone away from her and smashed it so she couldn't call a cab to leave the situation. He never hit her, but that still counted as physical abuse because he took away her ability to get to safety. It's also forcing drugs and alcohol on someone's partner. We see this through emotional abuse, things like verbal abuse and belittling the person, trying to make them feel inadequate. Psychological abuse, manipulating someone's thoughts or feelings, just again, trying to exert control over another person. We see this through financial or economic or educational abuse. A lot of people think this is just when we talk about money, and it is, but it's also taking away someone's resources, whether that's like if they're going back to school, not allowing them that opportunity. I see this with my youth that I work with a lot of the times in schools, where it's, well, if you skip class, then you'll prove that you love me, or like, don't go to soccer practice, and we don't find out it's a problem until later. We see this through sexual assault and sexual abuse. So any type of sexual contact or behavior that occurs without the explicit consent of the recipient. And whenever I say explicit consent, I mean the mutual agreement between participants to engage in any form of sexual activity. That has to be there. And it's recognizing that also comes into play here. We see this through stalking. A lot of people tend to downgrade stalking, but it's actually still a very serious crime due to its high prevalence rate as an indicator or a precursor to intimate partner homicides, which again is feeding into this missing and murdered crisis that we're talking about. But engaging in something that would cause a reasonable person to fear for their safety. And then we also see this through human trafficking, so the exploitation of someone for labor services or commercial sex. A lot of people tend to just focus on sex trafficking, and it's still a very serious crime that we should be focusing on, but we can't ignore as well labor trafficking that also comes with this. So to give you an idea of what this looks like when we talk about the Native American community and how prevalent these crimes are, what we find is that overall, more than 4 in 5 Natives, both women and men, will experience some form of violence in their lifetime. 56% of Native women experience violence in a given year. 55% of Native women experience rape or violence by an intimate partner. Almost half of Native women who have experienced violence have been victims of stalking. We also know that Native Americans are an extremely vulnerable population to be trafficked, and especially our Native youth, which we'll talk about here in a moment. And so what we find is that Native Americans actually experience violent crimes at 2 to 2.5 times the rate of other race ethnicity groups, and in fact, more than any other race or ethnicity group in the United States. And what we also find is there is a very distinctive factor when we talk about this violence when it comes to the demographic breakdown of the perpetrator and the victim. So oftentimes, when you look at the majority of cases, again, not all cases, but the majority of cases, when you look at the demographic race ethnicity of the victim and the perpetrator, they tend to be in the same race or ethnicity group in the majority of cases, except when we look at Natives. In 97% of cases for Native women and 90% of cases for Native men, their perpetrators, their traffickers, their abusers, their rapists were actually not Native. And so that's a very important piece of information that we can take as we start to combat this and move forward. We also know that our youth are at an extremely high risk for violence. So youth in the United States, so regardless of race, ethnicity, but in the United States, at least 1 in 3 will experience some kind of physical abuse, sexual abuse, or emotional abuse by someone they're in a relationship with before they become an adult. So before they're 18, before they can vote, before they can sign up for the military and do whatever else you can at 18. It's been a while for me, but they will already be experiencing and have been victims of relationship abuse. We also find that when we look specifically at the Native American population, our youth experience trafficking at alarming rates. The National Human Trafficking Hotline actually was looking at their cases from 2011 to 2017, and of their Native American trafficking victims, almost 40%, well over a third, involved a Native American minor, so involved a child or a youth. And violence actually accounts for 75% of deaths of Native youth between the ages of 12 and 20. So I don't say all this to scare all of you. I know this is a really heavy topic, but I say all of this so that we understand what we're up against and we can start to, especially if you're not part of the Native community, understand why we've put so much focus on this crisis and why we are here to say we need your help. Shifting focus a little bit to look specifically in on Nebraska. So some of the issues that we find here, there's a very high link between the disproportionality of MMIWG or MMIP and the child welfare system. Nebraska actually consistently ranks in the top 5 states for the highest disproportionality rate of Native children in the child welfare system. I usually have to tell people that's not something to brag home about. And so you may be sitting there and think, well, how is that related? Oftentimes, traffickers and abusers will oftentimes prey on vulnerable youth. And especially when you have a high number of children who are involved in the child welfare system, you sometimes lose kids in the system, or they are targeted by these perpetrators. And that's where you see a lot of this link. In Nebraska, specifically, the Sovereign Bodies Institute, which holds one of the largest databases for missing and murdered Indigenous peoples cases, They actually decided to look at Nebraska specifically and see what this crisis looked like here. They were doing it for a study in relation to the pipelines that have been proposed to come through the state. But they were looking at their cases, and what they found is that in Nebraska, Indigenous girls, so just Indigenous girls, represent 13% of all missing girls in the state, yet they only make up 1% of the state's population. Over half of their cases involve girls who are aged 18 and under in Nebraska. 2/3 of cases in Nebraska are not solved. Nearly half of the alleged perpetrators have never been charged, never been convicted, and 2/3 of the alleged perpetrators are not Native. So it gives you an idea of what it looks like here in this state and why this is a very big concern for all of us. Now, that's not to say if you're starting to get really down, my presentations tend to go, I depress you, I depress you, I depress you, and then I promise we will get a little more positive. There have been some recent efforts. So actually last year, there was a report that was part of LB 154, which was passed a few years ago, but in summer 2020, there was a report that was actually issued focusing specifically on missing Native American women and children. The results from that report and the recommendations that came out of it were very heavily law enforcement focused when responding to missing persons cases in Nebraska, but it at least was a first step. And I know the Nebraska Commission on Indian Affairs and Judy Goshkabas, who runs that, are focusing on more efforts to continue that momentum. We're not done, essentially. You may have also heard of Savannah's Act and the Not Invisible Act. These passed were signed into US federal law in September of 2020, again, focusing more efforts on this missing crisis and on the missing and murdered crisis, and specifically trying to get resources and promote that sort of intergovernmental coordination between the federal government, the tribal governments, and state governments to really clarify who's responsible for what and how can we all move forward together. So I'm going to pause to take a drink. I hope everybody takes a big deep breath in through your nose, out through your mouth. Like I said, this is heavy. So we're going to shift now into, okay, we know what we're dealing with. We know what this looks like. We know what the foundation of this problem is. How do we start to do better? And so tonight, what we're going to focus on is really looking at our relationships, and we're going to look at some of the concepts that we as community members, service providers, can start working toward to build these safer communities. So this first tool I have up here is something known as the relationship spectrum. This was actually released by Strong Hearts, which is a Native American domestic violence hotline. It's an incredible resource. And I share this actually with our youth a lot of the time, because a lot of times when we talk about violence, and especially violence and abusive relationships, people tend to focus on the extremes, right? Like we only really talk about this column. We only talk really about the bad things that are happening. But it's also important to recognize that while a relationship might not be abusive, that doesn't mean that it's healthy. It doesn't mean it's not toxic. And so I invite all of you, and especially if you work with youth who may be in relationships or starting to learn about relationships, that you all kind of use this to sort of look through it and see where your relationship falls. It doesn't mean that if you are falling into some of these categories that we can't do better, but it's recognizing that we can really start to assess our relationships, and we can look at the ways that we should be expecting and what constitutes a healthy relationship and how can we work toward that. We also wanted to talk tonight about this concept of body sovereignty and consent. So I think a big part of whenever we talk about intimate partner violence, and especially I can speak as a survivor of intimate partner violence and as a survivor of sexual assault, consent and understanding that you are the only person who has control and power and authority over your own body is extremely crucial for all of us as adults, and especially for our youth. So this concept of sovereignty, you know, I usually ask our youth, I'm like, have you guys heard of this term sovereignty? And usually I get a couple of hands that get raised because they've all heard of it in terms of tribal sovereignty, right? This concept that we as tribal governments have an inherent right to govern ourselves as tribes, that we are sovereign nations. It's how I got my marriage license and I got married through my tribal government. I vote in my tribal elections. That's our inherent right to govern ourselves. That's part of our sovereignty, this concept of power and authority. So taking that concept of sovereignty and applying it through the lens of body sovereignty is the concept that each and every person on this call in this world, you are the only one who has the full control and say over your own body. So no one else has any kind of say over your own body. And anyone who violates that through an act of violence or sexual assault, they are trying to take away your control, take away your power. They do not have a right to do that. They are violating your sovereignty. And so this is a very simple concept, and you may be sitting there just like, okay, this is really basic. But it really can be extremely helpful when we're talking to our youth and when we're talking to folks in our community. I've had, I have been very humbled to have elders who have heard me talk about this and have said, I never thought about it that way. And that really is going to help me when I go home and I think about, my life, and I think about my relationships, and I think about, teaching our children and our grandchildren how to move forward better. It's this concept of applying that power and authority. And it helps us to kind of better recognize some of these gray areas in a black and white situation and how to navigate those things. Sort of stemming off of that, we want to talk about, well, how do we talk about these things? We get very uncomfortable, right? Like trying to talk about consent or talking about anything really having to do with relationships. And, our kids don't really want to talk to us about it. So how do we kind of move forward and teach them these things so that they stay safe and so that we have healthier relationships in the future? So I always have to start by saying that the more comfortable you are, the more comfortable they are going to be. Kids are really smart. All of our youth are actually extremely incredible. I have such faith in our humanity, honestly, every time I talk to our youth in this current young generation. But they are also very intuitive. So they will pick up, if you don't want to talk about this, they don't want to talk about this, and they will shut that conversation down quickly. So it's recognizing that you have to be comfortable with it, that patience is key here. Being very patient with their questions, being very willing and open and honest is extremely crucial when we talk about this. And also recognizing that consent starts at a very young age, meaning that we can start modeling this behavior and empowering our youth from the time that they are little. So for instance, when we go to relatives' houses, how many of y'all, I'm sure, when you went to leave grandma's house or auntie's house or any relative's house, your parents or your guardians made you go around and hug and kiss everyone before you left. And I know, just speaking from my own personal experience, everyone used to make fun of my brothers because they did not like hugging anyone outside of our immediate family. And adults would actually try to pressure them to feel bad about that. I remember one of my brothers actually had a teacher who for some reason had a bet or something that she was going to get a hug out of my brother. And it's like, when you actually hear about it and you take a step back from that moment, you realize that doesn't sound right. But it's recognizing in those moments, what message is that sending later on? And a lot of times what that tells our youth is that they have to put the needs and desires of others above their own personal needs and desires, that their voice doesn't matter. Now, that's not to say that if you've done this or experienced this, that this is automatically a bad thing. I'm definitely not saying that, but it's just something to think about that's really important in putting that empowerment in our youth's voices. If they don't want to hug someone, even at a young age, we can honor that and respect that. We can ask first. I have, young nieces and nephews who they even model this by saying, can I give you a hug? To me. And it's just, we respect whenever they say yes, and they respect whenever I say yes or no. My tribe, I can always give the example, we're not a very touchy-feely group. Our closest translation of I love you is actually probably more akin to, I don't want to wear you out or exhaust you with too much affection or feel like I'm smothering you, so I'm going to respect your boundaries kind of thing. But it's much more, we can move forward in the sense of, I'm honoring your time, I'm honoring your energy, I respect your boundaries, I respect your voice. And I'm giving a very long explanation, but this is actually a very simple concept. And it's something that we can all start to think about and incorporate more. It's remembering, kind of as I gave you that long, complicated sort of scenario, the consent also is a very simple concept. And so we don't need to really add too many metaphors. We can really focus on keeping it simple, sticking with, what are the basics, what are the boundaries, and honoring and empowering our youth and their voice. So using tools like simple language, clear examples, immediately dispel, answer all of their questions and dispel any what ifs pretty early on. We as human beings tend to take pretty black and white, simple situations like consent, and we tend to gray them up a little bit. So really making sure that we stay clear in the message that we're giving them. And I also will say videos are very effective when you're talking about these things. There's a group called We Are Native that has some good videos on this. There's also, for those of you who have attended a presentation with me before, you may have seen, I tend to share the tea video, which puts the concept of consent in the form of, do you want a cup of tea? So things like that all can be useful tools, again, as we give our youth that empowerment to move forward in a better way. General best practices. So always, when I work with domestic violence programs, these are always kind of our core basics that we tend to focus on. And so this is for service providers, this is for community members. It's really just, again, emphasizing that we can move forward together in a better way. So first and foremost, prioritizing safety. I would really like if we all would start normalizing the question, do you feel safe? And if the answer is no, how can I help you feel safe? Because when we have survivors who come forward, you actually increase the likelihood that they're going to get access to the services they need. If you will help them adjust to the environment in a way that makes them feel safe. So for instance, at Legal Aid of Nebraska, sometimes we ask, do you feel safe talking in private? Do you want to talk more publicly or open? And that just gives them a little bit of that power back as they're navigating resources. Speak loudly, clearly, and simply, not in a way that belittles them, not in a way that talks down to them, but just in a way to recognize that you don't know everyone's story. And especially when we're talking about trauma and we're talking about survivors of violence, wanting to be very mindful that we have no idea what they're going through. And so it's okay that we have to repeat ourselves. It's okay that we have to answer several of the same questions. Just always wanting to be very clear and open and honest with them. Be supportive, listen to what they're saying, asking open-ended questions, so not just yes, no questions, because oftentimes what happens when we work with survivors, we get I've had to watch some folks who ask, well, are you a survivor of violence or are you a victim of domestic violence? And the person oftentimes will say no, and they may actually be, because it's a very odd question to ask. So asking more open-ended questions and focusing on, again, how can we promote that dialogue and how can we give them the opportunity to tell us what's been going on? Help them identify resources and people who can help outside of yourselves. It's fantastic. I'm so glad that Brooke had everybody, kind of put who they were in here, because this is now a network, right? This is a group of people who care about this problem, who want to come together to address this, and we can start sharing resources and have that community support. We can continue to also remind the survivor that it is never their fault. This can sometimes be really hard whenever we're in smaller communities and we all know each other. I come from a small community, so I understand how this works sometimes, but it's recognizing that no matter what the circumstances are, no matter what was involved, it's never going to be the survivor's fault. And they only deserve safety and respect and care in that moment. Understand that there may be some trust resistance. This is whether you're working with a survivor of trauma, but it's also for non-natives who may be on this call when you're working with the Native community. As we talked about, we've had about 500 years of not so great experiences. So there may be some trust resistance there. It's not personal. Recognize that you have to keep showing up and sort of continue to be open and honest and willing to assist and sort of work through that and have that patience. And then also understanding that no matter what happens, it's the survivor's decision moving forward, which means survivor decides if they get help, survivor decides if they participate in an investigation or file a police report. Survivor also decides if they go back to an abusive situation. And that's really difficult for a lot of us because, and especially for those of us who are in this line of work, you know, we can pour all these resources and pour all this time and this effort into this case. And then they make that decision to go back. But it's honoring the fact that it's their decision to make. It's also recognizing that when we talk about trafficking situations, when we talk about domestic violence, sexual assault, stalking, these are all extremely dangerous situations, and we don't know everything that's going on. It takes an average of 7 to 9 times for a domestic violence survivor to safely and permanently leave a domestic violence situation. And that's because oftentimes it is the most dangerous and the most lethal when they are trying to leave, because the perpetrator, the trafficker, whoever, is losing that power and control over that victim. And so they will do anything, including killing their victim sometimes, to keep that power and control. So it's recognizing that we have to continue to be open, that even if they walk through our doors or ask for help or reach out, you know, 7, 8, 9, 10, 20 times, I don't care. It's recognizing that we can always provide them with options. We can always at least listen, and we can always empower them to say, we're here and you can continue to ask for help and we're here to support you. General best practices for kind of fostering more inclusivity. Again, you know, really focusing on our youth here, focusing on moving forward in a better way, not just having this focus on specific individuals and leaving out others. So some general best practices here, focusing on more gender neutral language. So asking for someone's preferred pronouns or someone's pronouns. You know, that also is something that I think is becoming more normalized. And I'm so glad that it is, because especially, again, our youth are so emotionally mature, well beyond our years. And they even are just embracing this concept of gender identity and fluidity. And so just really, again, recognizing that you're going to increase the likelihood that they are going to stay safe and they're going to feel empowered if we can respect these parts of them. Using terms like significant other or intimate partner instead of boyfriend or girlfriend, and giving scenarios of various relationship types. So not just a boyfriend-girlfriend scenario or a straight relationship or a heteronormative example. And the reason for that is because I can tell you, when I've gone and given presentations with our youth, especially early on when I was doing this job, I you know, accidentally would slip into that. And our youth were the first ones to point out and say, but can't boys and men be victims of violence? And the answer is yes, absolutely. And so wanting to make sure that we include those, because unfortunately, a lot of times what happens with our youth is they don't hear examples or they don't think it applies to them, then they won't go get help, or they will find a way to convince themselves that what's happening is not abuse. I can speak from personal experience here that when I heard about sexual assault, I thought it was always the scenario of a stranger abducts you and assaults you. And so when my significant other, when my boyfriend was doing this to me, I convinced myself that it couldn't possibly be sexual assault, because that's what I had never heard of it constituting as, where your intimate partner would harm you like that. And so I didn't get help as quickly as I should have. It's also to be inclusive of, again, our Two-Spirit and our LGBTQIA plus relatives and individuals, because they can also be victims of relationship violence, and they face a struggle of having to overcome that a lot of times and not having that access to resources when they are in an abusive situation. It's also moving away from the idea that anything that doesn't fit sort of this predominant culture, Western European patriarchal society, that if it doesn't fit that mold, that it's not normal. We as tribes, I come from, just even for instance, I come from a matrilineal tribe. So everything we get, you know, with our clanships and our family relations, all that comes from our mother. That does not fit with a Western European patriarchal norm. But that doesn't mean that it's not okay. That doesn't mean it's not normal. That doesn't mean it's not, you know, there's nothing wrong with that. And so it's recognizing that we can be more inclusive of that, and we can recognize when we're falling into those patterns and how we can start to break that we can really embrace all cultures and all mentalities. Focusing on the behavior instead of the person. So again, really emphasizing this with our youth, because a lot of the times we have youth that may, you know, we know domestic violence is a learned behavior. Oftentimes, even when I worked with the previous offenders I mentioned, a lot of the times I could see how they were abusive and violent because of what they saw their parents doing. Now, that doesn't excuse their behavior, but if we have a willingness to change, we can embrace the fact that we can label this as bad behaviors versus a bad person. We have folks who can show up and are willing to change. And if they're willing to put in that work and to, really try to do better. And again, especially when we focus on our youth who are just learning how relationships work, we can start to empower them to change, and we can make it okay that they can change. Now, again, that doesn't mean that the victim ever has to forgive them. It doesn't mean that it excuses what they did. They still have to make amends for that. They still have to own up to that and take responsibility. But we can always have the open conversation that they can change and do better in the future. And that kind of coincides with, again, encouraging anyone involved that they can do better, that a victim can do better, that a perpetrator can do better, everyone can do better. And then always asserting the necessities of safety and respect above really anything else. If you don't take anything else with you today, asserting that we all can move forward and start normalizing this question of, are you safe and are you being respected in your relationship? And if the answer is no, then we need to start looking at that. And we can really start as a community to embrace those values and embrace those concepts. So that is what we have for you tonight. I know that was a lot to throw at y'all. Like I said, this is kind of our foundation. Next week, we are going to be talking about how to navigate when you're in the middle of a missing and murdered Indigenous person situation. So specifically focusing on, what do you do as a family? What are the steps that you take? How do you file? A lot of the legal sort of means to get access to information. So we're really going to be kind of diving into that next week. But I appreciate all y'all coming here. Sorry, my accent's coming out. All of you coming here tonight. And those of you who may be watching this on a recording later. These are some of the resources that we wanted to share. So again, I mentioned earlier, Strong Hearts Native Helpline. This is a fantastic 24/7 hotline available to Native survivors of domestic violence, sexual assault, stalking. So it's anonymous, it's open, it's culturally specific, culturally relevant, and is a really good first step for if you have somebody who's not quite ready to reach out to a domestic violence program or work with an advocate yet. It's also okay for community members or for folks looking for resources. They are just a fantastic resource to have to kind of help with that networking piece. Really cannot, commend the Nebraska tribal domestic violence programs enough. These are all of their phone numbers. So we have the Ponca tribe with their phone number. We have Winnebago, and we also have the Santee Sioux DTSU domestic violence program. All of these resources, they all have advocates. They all have a really committed staff. I can say as somebody who doesn't provide direct advocacy, but I really wish whenever I was in the initial stages of my surviving my abusive relationship that I had had resources like this. So please, if you are someone in a situation like this, consider reaching out. If you are a supporter of someone or if you are a service provider, please write these phone numbers down so that you have them. And we will share them at every single presentation from here on out. And then as we kind of wrap up, I do have to share about Legal Aid of Nebraska. So we are a nonprofit law firm providing free legal service to folks who typically don't have access to an attorney. And we do that in an effort to promote equal access to justice. Within that, we have our Native American program, which serves enrolled or enrollment eligible Native Americans here in the state of Nebraska with legal matters they may have. So they don't have to be a member of a Nebraska tribe, but they, so for instance, like I mentioned, I'm a citizen of Cherokee Nation. If I had a legal issue here, I could still reach out to Legal Aid for assistance. And we specifically focus on serving as well Native American survivors of domestic violence, sexual assault, human trafficking, stalking, and dating violence with legal matters pertaining to their victimization. So if they need help getting a protection order, if they need assistance with divorce or custody when they're fleeing an abusive situation, maybe I've gotten a lot of calls, especially with COVID, for housing issues. So all of that, this is our phone line and this is our online application that folks can access. Dawn, I see you have your hand up, so I will click to allow you to talk because I don't think you can unmute yourself.
Kirby, I sent you a text.
Okay.
Our new phone number is 844-823-6240, and it's toll free.
Excellent. I apologize. I will update that and make sure that that gets out to folks. Thank you so much for giving us that update.
You're welcome.
Yes, we want to make sure y'all get these phone numbers. So thank you, Dawn. Thank you to the Ponca tribe. Thank you to the Santee tribe. Thank you to everyone who joined us tonight. I will stay on as long as folks would like. I know we're kind of cutting it close to time, and I don't want to take up too much time in your evening. But if anyone has any questions, comments, concerns, please feel free to raise your hand or put those in the chat.
Kirby, thank you so much. It was so informative and powerful, and you always do such a good job. So thank you again for doing this. And I'm very excited for next Wednesday, the 19th for part 2. And hopefully, yeah, it'll be just as informative and exciting.
Thank you, Brooke. We really appreciate, like I said, being able to work with all y'all. I believe the same link that you guys used tonight should work for the future sessions. If you do have any issues, you all have my email. Please feel free to get in contact with me. And hopefully the recording worked tonight, so we will be able to upload this and y'all can share it out to anybody who may have missed tonight. But any other questions, comments, concerns? Alrighty, I see folks jumping off, so I will give you all back the rest of your evening. Please feel free to email us if you all have anything, and I hope we see you all next week. So have a great evening.